on how to identify and address hidden bias on your campus. And my name is Amy Julian. I'm the director for the Illinois Center for Specialized Professional Support at Illinois State University, and I'm going to be one of your presenters today. And here with me is Brittany Boston. And Brittany, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Brittany Boston, and I am the Associate Director for Equity and Outreach at the Center.
And so just a little bit of information about ICSPS. The Illinois Center for Specialized Professional Support has been around since 1977. And so Brittany and I haven't personally been involved with the center that long, but we have been around that long. And what we do is we create support and deliver professional development for career, technical, and adult education professionals across Illinois. Illinois also provides technical assistance. We develop publications and facilitate program improvement strategies for our partners as they relate to college transition, recruitment, retention, and completion. And one of the big things I like to say is our buckets are equity, access, and transition. And that is something that we're looking at. And then, of course, we always are working to encourage the achievement of special population learners. So what we have for you today is a fun agenda and really looking at defining implicit and explicit bias. And then we're going to talk about where bias hides on campus, a little bit of tips on marketing and recruitment. From there, we're going to move into the hidden bias that exists within our words. So exploring micro-messaging, microaggressions, and microaffirmations. And then we're going to give you some resources and send you on your way today. So that's a lot to cover in a short amount of time, but we will be getting through it. And if you have any questions, happy to answer those. Post those in the chat. If you are interested in listening to this again at some point, we are recording, and then the PowerPoint will be shared with you with the recording later. So with that, let's dive right in. So the first section there, we're going to define implicit and explicit bias. And so when we look at implicit bias, we're going to start there because explicit, I'm not going to go very far into that because that's really saying the things that we know we're biased about. So if you are a Cubs fan versus a Cardinal fan, that is explicit bias. You're aware of it, you wear your spirit wear, you have those things going on. Implicit bias is a little bit more challenging. Implicit bias is the attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions. It's an unconscious level of that. They encompass both favorable and unfavorable assessments. They are actively involuntary and without individuals' awareness or intention of control, and they reside deep in the subconscious. These biases are different from known biases that individuals may have or choose to conceal because of social or political correctness. So, for example, one of my fun examples is with implicit bias. If you are an American citizen and you are lost in a maze or lost in a car, you will turn left more than right. And as you're trying to navigate and get out of a situation, or if you are in a maze type situation, if you are from England or the parts of the world that drive on the other side of the road, you will turn right more than left. It is set up by your stereotype, by the way, and it's something that is completely unconscious, but has been looked at through a study of implicit bias. Implicit biases are pervasive and everyone possesses them. So that's really the most important thing. If you take nothing else away today, when we talk about bias, everyone has biases. Some are explicit, again, that Cub Cardinal fan, whether you're a Packers fan or a Bears fan, things of that nature. Those are explicit. We kind of pronounce those, we wear those on our sleeve. But today we're going to talk a lot about implicit biases that everybody possesses, and they are an avowed commitment to impartiality, such as the way in which we relate with other individuals, things that we think about when we see particular things happening. They are not mutually exclusive and may even reinforce each other from time to time. The implicit association we hold do not necessarily align or declared beliefs or reflect any stance that we have explicitly. So sometimes your implicit bias is actually in contradiction to your explicit bias, or to that last bullet there, those ideas of what we know to be not necessarily politically correct. So we know we don't want to have those feelings, but they are there in there. Our brains are incredibly complex, and the implicit associations we have formed can gradually be unlearned through various de-biasing techniques. So that's exciting too. As we move forward, we want to talk about and look at the way in which implicit or unconscious bias exists. So social stereotypes that we have that form outside form our own consciousness. They stem from our brain adaptions. They create unconscious barriers in our classroom, and they impact how we relate to people. Next, we'll look at the way in which we effects of unconscious bias, and why it's important to have this conversation and start with this conversation is the implicit bias influence how we reach decisions from our gathering and sorting and filtering, and they influence our evaluations of other people, including our students, our colleagues, and our partners, our friends, and their value. So they do play a role in the way we look at things. Unconscious bias may influence how we move through the world. A woman is less likely to be ascribed credit for a man's identical accomplishments, things of that nature. More often, a man is given the benefit of doubt over a woman in some situations. So this is all from a study that Moody did in 2007. But I just want to kind of dive into it a little bit deeper here. And let me give you some examples. So unconscious gender bias that exists. Can we go to the next slide there? Thank you. So yeah, these are animated, sorry. So the first click there, 360 college students are looked at, gender split 1-to-1. Okay, so equal numbers of male and female. Rated academic articles in politics, psychology of women, and education. 2 names reoccurred, but had identical work, John T. McKay and Joan T. McKay. The question is, with identical work, should there be any difference in how the students are rated, John versus Joan? So real quick, let's see if you're awake out there. Post that in the chat. Should there be any difference if they have the identical work? Is there any difference between John and Joan?
We're getting a lot of no's.
I see a lot of no's. Thank you for your contributions. Love it. See those popping in real fast. So the result, though, is that out of 5 possible points, John scored a full point higher than Joan. There was a consistent gender bias in favor of males as an author of academic work. We're aware of these biases. Has anybody heard there's a little series, they might have made a movie about it, called Harry Potter? Who wrote Harry Potter? J.K. Rowling, right? Is that a female or a male? Say it to yourself. You can shout out loud there, female, yes. But she used the alias or underscore or undersign of J.K. Rowling because she was concerned that her book would not sell as well if they thought a science fiction novel was written by a woman. So just something to ponder. We're going to give you another example. In 1970, females represented less than 5% of the symphony orchestras across the world, really. One of the things that what they wanted to do, and this is from a study done back in 1997, and I know that's a little dated, but it's still important, just a fun little note to think about. The number of female orchestra players increased less than 5% from 1970 into 1997. Once blind auditions were implemented, how many students do you think increased? So would blind auditions, what they did, they said, okay, we don't have enough females in here. Blind auditions increase the representation of women in the symphony. And again, throw in there, do you think it would make a difference if you have blind auditions? One of the things that they did with these blind auditions was they concealed the candidate's identity from the jury. They provided looking at the ways in which you could just not see the individual. So they'd come in onto the stage and they wouldn't be able to see who was playing, and they just went solely brought by their ability to play. So let's just click once, because I think I got this said this way. So once blind auditions were implemented by the mid-1990s, female participation increased to 25%. The blind audition fostered impartiality, but demonstrated results of sex-based hiring. The fun part about this is, so when they first did it, they put in just a curtain. So you couldn't see who was walking in, but you could hear who was walking in. And they found that the bias continued. Somebody has it in there, thank you, because of the clickety-clack of the woman's heels as they're walking in. And so that created an issue. Then they put it on a carpeted stage. And once the carpeted stage was imposed, that then increased the availability and opportunities for women. So thank you, Lydia and Stacy, you guys are right on it. So you've heard this before, maybe. So let's stop for a second to just say, we're aware bias exists. We're aware that those implicit biases are there, but let's kind of do a little self-reflection now. So our next slide is, what cultural stereotypes are prevalent on your campus or program? So are there any that you're willing to share in the chat there about, and again, if you don't want to share them in the chat, just kind of write them down on a sheet by you, because we're going to be talking about how we can address these hidden biases. But what cultural stereotypes are prevalent in your program or college? While you're typing, I'm going to share a fun story. So one of the things that I've encountered in my professional career is that with my email, and if any of you have gotten an email from me, the way it's set up is my first name is my last name and my last name is my first name. What that has led to over the years is often people think that my first name is Julian and my last name is Ame or Amy or some rendition of that. And so I have often had phone calls with individuals who don't know me or had not talked to me prior, who are surprised to learn that I am female. And it's interesting to see the tone or inflection change. And maybe you can't read inflection into email as somebody realizes your gender. So yes, we all have common biases. You guys have a lot coming in. Thank you for sharing these. I'm going to try to. And then as you're typing, I also want you to look at this next question of, what is the impact of these stereotypes on your students? As some of you are mentioning pre-apprenticeship programs in construction, difficult to break predominantly male field. Yes, we have that. Students from rural schools are hard workers and will be high-performing students in skills trade as opposed to students from more suburban schools. Wow, that is an interesting stereotype there. Students who are non-native English language speakers are not ready for college. That is a common stereotype that we find. And we have a couple of those that really do kind of present themselves in the idea of the assumption. So some assumptions are students from certain backgrounds are going to be poorer writers. They're not going to be as articulate as other students. Poor writing suggests limited intellectual ability, and that's misleading because it equates students writing with their intellectual ability. Another assumption that has come out of higher education is older students or students with physical disabilities are slower learners and require more attention for the instructor. And so a lot of these things do culminate, but the fact of the matter is these are all complete stereotypes. So let's move forward and discuss the danger of the single story. Now, there is a video that I'm going to share in the chat here. I do not want you to pause right now and go watch it. I'd like you to wait. But it is a 14-minute video that is just fantastic. And it talks about the single story. It is, and one of my favorite quotes from the movie or from the TED Talk is, the single story creates stereotypes, and the problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, but that they are incomplete. That makes one story become the whole story. And I think that's really one of our biggest dangers when it comes to stereotypes, is they take one little fragment of one person and they focus in on that. Instead of seeing the complete person, they focus in on that particular attribute. And so I do encourage you to go read that later. I mean, not read that, watch that later as a resource. But I do want you to think about that as we're talking about hidden biases on campus and some of these implicit biases that have occurred and that we're now aware of because we've opened that door for conversation. Where do we see some of our hidden biases on campus? So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Brittany.
Yes, thank you. Okay, so we're going to talk about where those biases can hide on campus, and we're really going to focus in on marketing and recruitment, because when we talk about bias, whether it's implicit, unconscious, it can be a bit overwhelming as to, you know, where do we start? How do we correct this? What is that first step that we need to take in order to really combat that bias that's on our campus? And the marketing and recruitment, the imageries and the language that you put out into your community about your campus and your programs is the first place that you can start. And so we really want to look at sort of this concept of mindful marketing and recruitment. We want to be intentional about the language that we use, about the images that we're using. So you'll see a few bullet points here. Now, again, this is not an all-inclusive list of how we can, use this mindful marketing, but it is just a few things to be aware of and to be conscious of when you're creating new marketing materials, or when you're going back and reviewing some of the marketing that maybe you've already had in production, or your website, things that you have posted around your campus, so on and so forth. So when we're talking about marketing our programs and marketing our institutions, we want to make sure that we're using gender inclusive language or gender neutral language. We're not just recruiting one particular gender, right? We're actively seeking students of all genders. And some of the most simplistic examples I can give here is when we say firemen or policemen, right? We want to say firefighter or police officer because those careers are not gendered. It's not meant for one specific gender. So we want to make sure that we're being very neutral in the language that we're using. And when we are creating those promotional materials, whether they are commercials or flyers that you create, or even the imagery on your website, making sure that we're including those photos and even testimonials, those student success stories of current and diverse learners and graduates. So we want to make sure that not only are the images that you are putting out into the community representative of your community, but also you want it to be representative of the individuals that you are trying to recruit and market to your programs. People want to be able to see themselves, right, in a program. They want to know, they want to see people that look like them, that have the same abilities as them, that are engaging in that program and being successful in that program, and knowing that when they come in, they're going to feel like they belong, they're going to feel a connection, they're going to feel a part of the campus and institution. And again, I touched base on this a little bit, but also including pictures with individuals in context or actively participating in the classroom, in the lab, being an active student on campus, or even in a Zoom classroom, being an active learner, not just, sitting on the quad eating lunch or walking down the halls, actually being an active learner. And then helping to dispel stereotypes. So stereotypes can be held by instructors, they can be held by parents, they can even be held by the learners themselves regarding what opportunities are actually available to them when it comes to college and post-secondary education. And so we want to make sure that we start this early. We want to dispel those stereotypes early by increasing the exposure and raising awareness within the recruitment process. So looking at, junior high, high school, and really making sure, being cognizant of that marketing and recruitment language and materials that we are putting out and presenting to potential future students for the community college system or universities, and making sure that we are helping to dispel those stereotypes of, welding being a male field or dental hygiene being a female field, making sure that we are actively having those conversations as well. And then again, I touched base on it, but it is so important, making sure that we are being intentional in representing all students. And so using images of diverse students, diverse learners when it comes to your marketing and recruitment materials, not only on handouts and hard copies, but online as well. And one of the things I will say, because I've created a few documents here in my time, and stock photos are not my favorite. I prefer to see images and photos of current or graduated students actually participating, in their program, in their classroom. But if you have a program within a community and you are looking at your data, you're looking at your numbers, and you're seeing that you have quite a significant population of ESL individuals, but your ESL student enrollment is rather low. And so if you are not getting that full representation through actual images of your students, I think stock images can come into play there in order to use that. But if you have the ability to show the diverse nature of your program, of your student body with actual images of students engaging in their coursework and in their labs, absolutely, that is the best practice. Seeing those real students engaging in your programs.
Brittany, I want to pause right there because we do have a question. So Angela, I'm going to unmute you, Angela Norwood, and you are able to share.
Oh, I didn't have anything to share. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to raise my hand. Sorry.
No, that's okay.
Sorry.
All right, I'll go back and mute you again. No, that's absolutely fine. Again, I think that's a great demonstration. So if you do have a comment, go ahead and raise your hands and we'll be able to unmute you. So Angela, I didn't mean to pick on you. I just saw your hand up and I wanted to be able to give you the floor. So Brittany, go ahead.
Yeah. And so I wanted to really hone in here on websites when it comes to institutions and for programs. And now I'm going to step out on a limb here and assume that a lot of the people participating on the webinar today maybe are not the first point of contact when it comes to your website and what that looks like or how it's designed. But I would encourage you to, after this webinar, really browse your website and try and experience it from a potential student's perspective. And right now, with the pandemic and a lot of our contact being virtual, your website may be that first point of contact or first point of interaction that a potential student has with your institution or with your program. So when you're navigating through your website, is it easy to navigate? Are there items set in place that can help for maybe individuals who are colorblind or have, who has English as a second language? Is there the ability for them to manipulate that text into the language that is their native language that they are comfortable with? Is it designed and inviting for all potential students? Is the imagery that is being used representative of the community that your program is in and of the community that you are marketing and recruiting? Can potential students see themselves represented on your website? Is it accessible? Is it intuitive? With everything being virtual now, we want to make sure that our website is inviting and friendly and easy to navigate, because we don't want that to be a deterrent to potential students and say, well, I wanted to find out about the automotive program, but I had to click through like 7 different pages before I got to anything. Mm-hmm. Nobody's, that's frustrating. Nobody's going to want to take the time to do all of that. And so just being very conscious of, again, those images and the language that we are using when we are marketing our programs and intentionally trying to recruit students. Because if you've been a part of any of the webinars that Amy or myself have done, we always talk about how a student wants to be able to feel like they belong somewhere. They want to be able to make those connections and build those relationships. And if they don't see themselves off the get-go, they're not going to continue to engage in that process. And then once you get them in there, we need to continue to build that relationship to keep that engagement going. So, you know,
Yeah.
it all snowballs. It's all a process, right?
It does all snowball. And thank you, Amy added in the comment box, understanding user experience design is critical when designing websites and courses. And why we're spending a little extra time on looking at bias within your website and looking at accessibility within your website is because a year ago, the world flipped upside down. And our front doors to our campuses no longer were actually our front doors to our campuses. They became our websites. So looking at the way do all of the students who you are trying to reach find what they need intuitively and accessibly on your campus is really important. And also with your course design, are you accessible? Is it intuitive? Does it make sense? Are you creating frustration for your students? So looking at that user experience design is so, so very important. And we really do encourage you to work with your IT individuals and look at that. And then also exactly what Brittany's been talking about, making sure they see themselves in your institution. So that's also a good lens to don as you're looking through your materials. I think we're going to move into hidden bias in your words. And so this is where we're going to dive into that idea of implicit bias, because often with implicit bias, those things that we are thinking sometimes come out of our mouths. And we want to talk about what microaggressions look like, what microaffirmations look like, and how are we aware of our own bias. And sometimes, I mean, have you ever been startled that you say something? Mine's usually in a family setting where I'm startled that I've made some comment that I probably shouldn't have made. But we're going to do what I like to call the iceberg activity. And not only does the idea of the iceberg kind of fill everybody up, but it's a good way to look at students. So when you look at an iceberg, what do you see? You see the top part, right? You see, and it's not my arrow. I'm like circling it on my screen. It's not my arrow, but you see that top part of the iceberg, okay? You don't see everything underneath. You see that top part. Our students are the same way. So if I'm going to show you a picture of a student, and I want you to tell me some of the things that you are perceiving about the student or that you think about the student just from looking at the student. This is not anybody I knew or know. This is just a stock photo to Brittany's point. But tell me, what are some assumptions that you make about the student just by looking at them? Thank you, Marion. He's a student because I keep saying student. When we talk about diversity, we also need to think about what are those attributes that we're looking at, and then what does that mean? And I'm going to encourage you to look at more than just the surface level of our students, because diversity is really embracing the entire student and seeing our students as individuals. So some fun things that are coming in. He looks young. He needs a new backpack. He is excited about school. He's smiling. All right. He's a young adult. He wears sunglasses and a jacket. Guys are pointing out I have never noticed that the backpack's not brand new. So, all right. He looks intelligent. Use this picture a lot, and no one's pointed out that the backpack's not brand new, but that's okay. Again, everybody sees through a different lens, so this is fantastic. Everyone is assuming that he's male. Good point. He could be. Okay, excellent. Now we're getting into some of the, seems approachable. Fantastic. So I want to keep him in mind and keep that iceberg in mind and go to the next slide, which is that idea of that waterline of visibility. So when we look at our students, what we're able to see, just like in the iceberg, is what's at the top. We can see skin color. I will tell you, I tried very hard to find a graphic that didn't have gender at the top, to the point of the individual who said, we assume he's a male, but I'm going to have to create my own because I could not find one. But we kind of can gauge his age. We can gauge sort of an assumption on his race. We can do the skin color. That idea of nationality, physical ability, ethnicity, wealth, sociological status, I can't talk, culture, and religion are on that line, like maybe, maybe not, depending on who the student is, how, what information they're sharing or wearing on their sleeve and what information they're not. But there is so much under the surface that we don't know. We don't know their value systems, their learning styles, their heritage. We don't know the languages, their educations, their talents. We don't know their location or division, their work style, their skills, their beliefs, their sexual identity, their sexual orientation, their thinking style, their life experience, their personality profile. We don't know any of those things. So the purpose of this exercise is to really have you thinking about when a student comes into your class or when a student comes into your institution or however you're engaging with your students, with your colleagues, with your peers, you're only seeing the top part. You're only seeing that very surface part. It takes action by you to really get under the surface. And the reason I want to talk about that is because that's where, unfortunately, we have those micro messaging and those biases can shape the way that conversation goes. So I challenge you all to take the time, because yes, to James's point, there's so much is invisible. Take the time to get to know our students. Take the time to see our students as individuals. Take the time to dispel and puncture those biases that do, or stereotypes that do exist. So our bias shapes our worldview and the words we use. And so we've talked about stereotypes. We've talked about what stereotypes exist on our campus. We've talked about, and I'm sure you probably thought to yourself, some different stereotypes that exist out there. But what stereotypes do is they do influence the way in which we communicate. And so we have micro messages. And let's talk just for a second about actually, I'm going to tell you a story first, and then we're going to talk for a second about micro messaging. So have any of you heard of Whistling Vivaldi? That is our next, yeah. So Whistling Vivaldi is a book that was written by Dr. Claude Steele. He is the dean for the School of Education at Stanford University. And he wrote a story about Brent Staples. And one of the stories in the book, this book is really about dispelling stereotypes, but one of the stories in there is about Brent Staples. And Brent Staples was a graduate student at the University of Chicago. And when he was traveling to school and walking around the south side of Chicago, he found that many of the white people in that community were seeing him as a mischievous African-American male and not as a grad student. And it bothered him, it depressed him. And he was looking at ways to really address that issue because he wanted to puncture that stereotype. What he found was, and he wrote this up, it was a article that he wrote because he's now an editor for, and I can't remember what magazine he writes for now, that if he whistled Vivaldi or whistled Beatle tunes, it would puncture that stereotype that he was a menacing young man. It had and enabled individuals to see him as he was as a graduate student. So I'm going to put another little, yes, I'll put those all, I'll share these all with everybody who's on the phone as well. But this is a fun little video, again, on YouTube about looking at the way in which we see people and what does that mean. And Steele really dives into stereotype and stereotype threat. And I think now is a good time to tell you, like, I teach a 16-week course on these topics. So for me to squeeze this all into an hour, I really had to just take that tip of the iceberg. So we're going to give you as much information as we can in this hour we have together. And then if there are additional professional development or additional webinars or in-person trainings you'd like to see, we're going to have an evaluation and that will go out, and then you can let us know if you'd like to see some additional professional development around these areas. So let's dive into a little bit about what micro-messaging is. So micro-messages are small, they're subtle, they're semi-conscious messages that we send and receive when we interact with others. They embrace everything from tone to body language to what is said and how it is said. And so my favorite example, which I have been called out that apparently it doesn't mean the same in all areas, but if I am not pleased with something that has happened with my husband and I, and he asked me how I am, and I don't really want to discuss it, I say I'm fine. And maybe I fold my arms and maybe I look away, or maybe I'm diligently doing the dishes or something, but body language will tell a story, right? The tone of the word fine, and he refers to it as my 4-letter word, which I use other, so I'm kind of surprised. But what he said, what I say and how it is said is as important as what is said, right? Because the word fine is a lovely word. And maybe I am in fact fine, but it's the idea of, oh, sure, honey, I'm fine with you, you know, staying out all night or something like that. That was when we were much younger. So let's talk about, those are the ideas of how we communicate. So let's move into micro inequities and microaggressions. So micro inequities are those negative messages, those things that we do that devalue, slight, discourage, and exclude individuals. They are things that we say or things that we do that make people not feel as included as other words. My story here, and this is one who, if she ever knew I told the story, she'd probably disown me, but one of my very dear friends, when we were juniors in high school, she got a perm, again, I'm a child of the 90s, don't judge. She got a perm, braces, and glasses all within the same week. And she came to school and looked completely different. And one of my other friends said, oh, you look, what did she say? You look great. And I used the term different. See, I just used that then too. And it was so hurtful for her, for me to say that she looked different, because she didn't want to look different. She wanted to look the same. So again, the intent did not match the impact, but those are things we'll talk about in just a second as well. So I want to give you some examples of microaggressions that we see in society, or maybe you've heard around campus. Courtney, I never see you as a Black girl. And again, kind of open your eyes there. If you don't see me as that, are you really seeing me? You're not really Asian. I have 2 nieces who are both Chinese, and they hear this all the time in their school. And it's something that we talk about often, is how do they not see me as somebody who has a different background than my peers. And then you don't act like a normal Black person, is what it says on that third one, in case your screens are small. And again, what implications, what message is that really sending when we're saying those things to our students, or we're hearing those things come from someone's mouth? So on the other side of that coin is the idea of microaffirmations. These are positive messages that can make others feel included and valued and encouraged. And those are things like having someone say, good job, or you're a rock star, or that's fantastic, or ways in which you're asking them to play, or asking them to engage, or having those group dynamics shared, or simply just making them feel valued. I appreciate your time. I appreciate your hard work on this. I appreciate the time that you spent on this, and then going into whatever you want to say. So let's dive next into those key elements of micro-messaging. So both microaggressions and microaffirmations. So the first is the verbal, the what is said. And again, to that point, where did you get your hair cut? It's a very simple question, right? But depending on the way you say it, could really depend on the way in which someone perceives it. Like, where did you get your hair cut? Or, hey, where did you get your hair cut? Those are 2 different things, right? Are you hearing my inflection without even seeing my face? So the paraverbal, how it's said. Can any of you think of some time when somebody has said something and the words they're using are just fine, but what they're saying is said in a different context? So maybe an example would be, did you agree to do it? With different inflections, you could either be in trouble, you could be excited about adding someone into a group. Think about the way in which we use words. Then my favorite, because I have preteens and teenagers in my house, the nonverbal, the body language. 80% of human communication is not what we say, it's how we say it and the body language that is conferred with it. So if you have in your family home, or just get to see one on the street, the teenagers in the world, they possibly roll their eyes, they yawn, they lay back, they sit back in their seats, they slump. They are communicating so much or maybe just mine, in the nonverbal. But you also see this in meetings. I'm not saying anything just about teenagers. I just have personal experiences with those. But you see it in meetings. You see it in the way in which we work with each other, the way in which we act. What are those nonverbal cues? The tapping of the foot, the clicking of the pen, the slumping back in the seat, maybe the camera's on, but they're asleep, things like that. And then you look at the contextual. Who or what else is present when you're saying whatever it is that you're saying? Giving a male a feminine pen and saying, oh, this is pink or cute or something like that. A female asking them if they're going to be able to like handle the machinery and the trades, or asking if they understand something with the machine that they're driving. The context, the words might not be as interesting as the context. And then omission. So what is said or not said? What is done or not done? You know, if you go up to a group of 3 people and you only invite 2 of them to go out to lunch with you, omission. What is said or not said? And then the last one is praise or criticism. And most people really do understand this, that idea of, are we praising someone or are we criticizing? And there absolutely is a way to constructively criticize individuals without making them feel lesser than. There's also that idea of growth mindset, which we have a whole training on that I'm not going to go into today, about how you look at growth mindset versus fixed mindset, and whether or not you see criticisms or critiques as a positive or a negative, an area for improvement, or that everyone hates me and I'm doing a horrible job. So those are the key elements of micromessaging. And one of the things that I wanted to talk to you about, because I wanted to bring this up today, was the idea of being aware of our biases. So we're going to go to the next slide. And the important part, again, so first thing I want you to take away, no matter what, is everybody has biases. Everybody does. And whether you're aware of them or not aware of them is completely up to how you perceive yourself and how others perceive you. But there is things that we can do to really, and we're going to give you a study. There's a fun Harvard implicit bias study that I'm going to send out in the resources as well. But the second thing that I want you to take away from all of this is the impact of our own micro messages can make a big impact on our students. And so we use that term micro messaging, and that's the term that a lot of the literature use. But I really want to argue that there is nothing micro about the messages that we're sending. If you are saying, where'd you get your hair cut? And meaning that it is like, oh my gosh, I cannot believe you did that to yourself. That has an impact. If you are looking at someone and saying something like, you're going to wear that, and saying it in the tone that I just used, there is a big impact. So what's important is that though we're using micro, I really don't like that. I'm probably going to stop using that and moving it into just the idea of macro messaging or implicit bias messaging, because there is an impact, and the impact is not always what the intent is. So back to my conversation with my husband about how I'm fine. My intent is that he understands that I'm not fine, but I'm not going to discuss it right now. But that's much different when you're having a conversation in a professional setting or with a student, because you want to be sure that your intent and your engagement is linked to your impact. And if your impact is different, then that's where we have an issue, because the intent is not as important, or as I worded it this way, the impact is more important than the intent. The intent is not as important as the impact. Have you ever heard somebody say, I didn't mean to say hurt your feelings? I didn't mean to say it that way. I'm sorry it came across that way. Anybody ever have that happen? Or no? Everyone else communicates?
My favorite is no offense, but no.
My favorite is with all due respect, because usually when someone says with all due respect, whatever is coming afterwards is not with all due respect.
Mm-hmm.
Or, oh, what is the other one that I just love so much? Oh, good for you. Have you ever noticed the implications of good for you or good for them? When you say that, you don't actually mean any goodwill. You many times mean like, well, good for them. And that idea of, yeah, I don't care, or not my problem, or something like that. Oh, I love these. Are bless your heart. Oh, my grandmother, yes. Honey, I love you, but. Ooh,
My
yeah,
husband called me out on that the other day. He's like, I always cringe when you say I love you because 9 times out of 10, it comes with a but afterwards.
well, sadly, I'm guilty of doing that with my kids. Like, honey, I love you, but I need you to pick up your shoes. My son wears a size 11 shoes, guys. I mean, I am falling over those things all the time. So the bless your hearts, I hear it, yeah. But I'm excited because you're understanding what I'm saying. So we need to be thinking about what our impact is, and more important than our intent. And, don't take this the wrong way, or don't say that the wrong way. Well, then maybe you shouldn't say it if you're going to lead with that. I love that, Justin. Thank you. Please don't take this the wrong way. But yeah, or please don't, I'm not going to, with all due respect, if an insult is following, the insult is taken, and we need to consider the impacts. So I want us to think about that and think about our engagement with students. The other thing that I really want to caution you about is you're looking for that hidden bias on your campuses. We've talked about your marketing, we talked about your recruitment, but let's talk for a second about your one-on-one communication with your students and how that looks, because that is really where these micro messages come into play, and that is really where that impact is so much more important than the intent. Before we move on, I want to show you one little cartoon, and this is a fun little one that I found. And so if you can't read it, I'm going to read it to you. So there's a gentleman in the wheelchair there, and he says, could you please shovel the ramp? And the gentleman who is shoveling the stairs says, all these other kids are waiting to use the stairs. When I get through shoveling them off, I will clear the ramp for you. And then the gentleman in the wheelchair says, but if you shovel the ramp, we can all get in. This is I use this for my UDL trainings for Universal Design for Learning, because it really does look at the way in which if you support those individuals who have a physical impairment, you are actually supporting all individuals. But also it just shows the bias of the individual they're shoveling, because they're not understanding that what they're doing is actually not as productive as they could be if they just shoveled the ramp. And they are showing bias towards those who are more able-bodied than those who have disabilities. So I just wanted to share that with you for fun. The next slide, we're going to talk about how words can inspire and words can destroy, and how you need to choose your words well. This is by Robin Sharma. I just like the quote. It's just really important. As a mother, I find it important to help my children understand that the words they choose to use do have power, and that they need to choose their words carefully. And I think that is also our role as educators as well, especially in the world we live in today. So moving forward, a big part of assessing the current reality is becoming aware of the words we use and the stories we tell about ourselves and our reality. For many, it is harder than crafting a clear, compelling vision, but the mastery of the power of the word is really important, and it greatly increases the likelihood of success for our actions. So many of you on this call are educators, and many of you are working in the idea that I want to teach our students something, right? They're coming to your class, we want to teach them something. But the power of the words are so very important. And I want to just share a little story with you as we move this next slide here. The words we use kind of act as a map for our world. And so whether or not we're showing somebody how to weld or put together an automobile or give a speech, the words are very important. And to successfully access our words and use our words, they need to be accurate as well as we can make them. So I'm going to tell you a story about the Titanic, the Carpathia, and the Frankfurt, and about this little different system called CQD versus SOS. And maybe many of you know this, but if you don't, I'm going to share my history nerddom, because I'm a big history nerd, for those of you who didn't know. And all of us know about the Titanic, right? All of us know that the ship that got to the Titanic first was the Carpathia, correct? But there was a ship called the Frankfurt that was fairly close. it could have been there within 2 hours, whereas the Carpathia took about 4 hours, so double the time. And if you are familiar with the history of the Titanic, if it would have gotten there at say 2 a.m. instead of later, it would have saved thousands of lives. So one of the things that's important is as the Titanic hits the iceberg, and I guess I have an iceberg theme going on for everybody today, but as the Titanic hits the iceberg, the Captain Smith says to the telegraph operators, we need to send out a distress signal. And what happens is they send out the CQD. And the CQD was a British termed messaging instead of the SOS. So the SOS, a little history on the SOS, it was approved in the, I think it's the Berlin Accords in 1906. It was implemented by 1909. And so in 1912, when the Titanic sank, it was very much had been part of the system for 3 years. And so when you're looking at the idea of the distress call, what went out is important. So the CQD, it says, basically it's an all call to any ships near, and then it says that there's a distress. The D is for distress or disaster or something of that caliber. But the SOS does not stand for Save Our Ship, actually, for those of you who thought that it did. The SOS is actually just an easy and distinctive way to communicate. But you had two different telegraph operators or businesses at the time competing. You had Marconi versus Telephonic. And so when they sent out the distress signal, they used the CQD, and the Frankfurt, being a German ship, was on the Telefunken. And they actually had a situation where, because they got the CQD instead of the SOS, the captain of the Frankfurt asked, tell us more about what's going on. What is your situation? What's wrong? What do you need? And in that time, the Carpathia had said that they were coming, and the telegraph operator said, okay, well, the Carpathia is a British ship. They're going to be able to rescue us. I'm going to assume that they didn't think that they were going to really go down as fast as they went down. And so he told the Frankfurt he called him a fool twice, and then he told him to not bother. And so the Frankfurt kept to his own course and did not go to rescue the Titanic. And we all know the rest of the story, though. But the issue is, let's look at some little things there. Had someone, and in this case, Phillips, used the proper messaging, the message would have been received differently, and possibly the story would have been completely different. But the power of the word, the power of understanding where you are and giving direction to who you are and how those things happen is so important in the way in which we communicate. And it's really important for us to understand where we're going to be. So the words we use and how we put them together in a sentence, in a story, can make a difference in whether or not we get to where we're going to go or not. And whether or not the Carpathia shows up 4 hours later, or the Frankfurt would have showed up in 2 hours' time. And this is kind of a fun little history nerd thing, but the idea is still the same with our classrooms. Are we painting a picture with our words to get to where we want to go? Or are we creating barriers with our words by sending micromessaging that is creating instances where the students, instead of focusing on the curriculum or focusing on what you're trying to say, are focusing on what you said to them? I'll give you another example. The other day, in a conversation about something, there was a general reference to individuals, and it was again about people who write grants and how we were childish and we wanted things our way. And I'm not sure that there was malice intended there, but the fact that for some reason the way it was framed and the words that were said just resonated with me, and they bothered me, and I was, I spent my weekend just angry about it. But the fact of the matter is, if we do that to our students, if we put our students in a position where they're worried more about how we said something or the words we used, instead of the messaging that we're trying to get across, the curriculum that we're trying to teach, it defeats the purpose. So I really want us to caution and think about the words we use. I want to give you some recommendations before we close out today, because I know we've got about 5 minutes left. So First thing, if you have never taken the implicit bias test, it is a fantastic and interesting test to take. I use it all the time when I teach on implicit bias, and we'll send that out as the implicit bias through Harvard. You can take and see if you have implicit bias about race, sex, ethnicity, politics, Coca-Cola, all kinds of fun things. There's tons of tests on there. Spend some time, have some fun, enjoy just finding out a little bit more about yourself. I promise you, something you'll say is fantastic, and I agree with that. Other things you'll say, there's no way, this test is stupid and it's wrong. And then you'll take another test and say, wow, okay, maybe I need to address that. But again, that's for you, for self-reflection. Have a great time. Culture inclusivity. I do encourage instructors to work on inclusivity in the classroom climate and looking at inclusive teaching practices, which can be, mediate a professional bias attitude and support developing sensitivity and deepening awareness of the instructor. So if that's something you're interested in, let us know, because those are things that we like to talk a little bit more about. The next thing I encourage you to do, if you are faculty, if there's any faculty here on the line, solicit feedback from outside observers. That is not always fun, but it is always very helpful. Ask instructors to set up a teaching inventory or observation protocol with a colleague or a peer, or maybe, I know when we teach at ISU, we have a Center for Improvements in Teaching. I think they're called CAST, and they have, they come in and they'll watch your class. They'll come in and observe for you and give you some pointers and some observations and provide feedback. If you're, I encourage you to do that, but if that's not your thing, the other thing I encourage you to do is solicit feedback from your students. Instructors can also use feedback from your students. Use that midterm course evaluation, end-term evaluation, small group feedback sessions. The important thing about feedback, though, is if you're going to collect it, use it. Don't just collect it to say you collected it and check that box. I do encourage you to use it and find a way to collect it in a manner that you feel comfortable with. I do think it is tough being evaluated, but at the same time, it is so valuable and it will so help you improve your instruction and look at just through that continuous improvement lens. And students, when they know you're listening, are more thoughtful and intentional in their comments than if they think you're just not listening. But it's also a way to see if they feel that you've been heard. I have another quote coming up next. So on the path to discovery, your shortcomings, don't forget the yet. And this is something that just goes back to growth mindset. Again, we didn't really get to dive into growth mindset today, but I think when we're talking about the ways in which we look at ourselves and the ways in which we're reflecting on bias, and I am challenging you to really do not only some institutional reflection, as Brittany walked us through, but also some personal reflection. Don't forget the yet. And the idea is that if you refrain from using a declarative statement of I've never water skied, but if you add a yet to the end, it changes the whole perception of the statement. I haven't water skied yet, and it adds that little bit of hope. And there's just a fantastic little resource. Again, here's another YouTube, though I see other people posting YouTubes in there, so I'm excited for the resource share that's going on. This is a fun little video. I'm not going to show it to you, but it's a little song about the power of yet. And yes, that is Sesame Street. And yes, I'm a child of Sesame Street. But love the idea of growth mindset. And Lacey, if you'd like to see a session on growth mindset, we'd love to do that for you. Just let us know if that's something you're interested in. We also have additional resources. And I'll post up that last slide of our contact information so you can send us an email. And then I'll also put my personal email in the chat box there. But Brittany, do you want to walk us through in the last 2 minutes about some of the resources that we have for them? I know I put the SOPR strategies are already in the chat there, but what else would we like to share?
Yeah, so if you see on this last slide here, and I'll actually go ahead and type it in the chat as well, we have our website address. And on there, if you in all the spare time that we all have, right, you can jump on there and browse around. We do focus, as Amy said, on equity and transition and recruitment. And so you'll see that our website it is designed around that. We have an equity tab, we have a recruitment tab, And we have done some previous webinars on mindset. We've partnered with NAPE, the National Alliance for Partnerships in Equity. Did I get that
Yep,
acronym
you
correct?
got it right. Yep.
We've partnered with CAST for Universal Design for Learning. And so I didn't really want to, I feel like if I listed everything out, we'd have 6 different slides with everything listed. So please jump on there, browse around, see what you can find. Under our equity tab, we talk a lot about the Office for Civil Rights and civil rights reviews, and how, you know, there are laws put in place that prevent discrimination for students, for public entities. And so really looking at that, because it all goes hand in hand. And the reality of it is we could sit here for, you know, 2 months and talk about different topics when it comes to bias and micromessaging and all of that. So please feel free. I haven't put it in the chat yet because I can't type and talk at the same time, but check out the website if you have any questions. Either email myself or Amy, or if there's topic areas that we've missed, you will be getting a follow-up email within the next day or two with an evaluation. And on that, we will ask you, you know, when it comes to bias, are there specific areas that you want us to dive in deeper? Is there professional development that you really feel is pertinent that hasn't occurred yet? And so we definitely want to hear from you.
So I did put the link to the implicit bias test in there. I've used that with my students several times. They do ask for some information about you taking the test. I usually let it be the preference of the student. If they want to put that in, I don't put it in because I fill out enough forms. But you can still have access to all the implicit bias test without filling out that information. And they have stuff on gender, presidents, weapons, weight, disability, skin tone, transgender, religion, age, sexuality, Black, Asian American, Arab, all of it. Have a great time. It'll be fantastic. And if you have any questions, let me know. I've taught on that for about 15 years now. So it's a lot of fun for me to have that experience with students. And most of my students are adult age. They're not the traditional 17-year-old. So lots of fun. Thank you all for your time today. Sorry, we went over by a minute. If you have anything you have questions about, please reach out to us. And we look forward to seeing you on our upcoming webinars. Thank you.
Thank you so much.